me great pleasure to welcome you to the Parliamentary Pavilion for the launch of this joint statement on the relevance of the NDCs with the next generation of framework climate laws, why that connection matters, why we have this very unusual and I think very timely partnership between ClientEarth, Globe and WWF. So what we'll do in terms of the format today is, as you can see, there is a person missing over here. We have an empty chair for Manuel, who is on his way. We'll kick off with an introduction to why we are working together and why these issues matter. We'll then invite expert contributions. As you can see from behind me, but I'll just go through them for the benefit of those who can't see from the back. So, of course, the theme of our statement is on robust NDCs 3.0, the next generation of framework climate laws and the role of parliamentarians. We will have Manuel Pulgar Vidal, who will speak to the NDC part of the statement. And Manuel, of course, is the International Global Climate and Energy Practice Leader at WWF. We will then have Bolek Matuszewski, who is a lawyer at ClientEarth, and myself. And after the three of us have introduced the key components of the joint statement, we will then move to contributions from Mr. Jan Dusic, Deputy Director General for Climate Action at the European Commission, Matt Toombs, the Director of International Climate Change at the UK Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, and then finally Sanjay Lee, the UNDP Global Technical Specialist on NDCs, Green Economy and the Just Transition. And we will then have some time for contributions from Mr. Cedric Froelich, the Honourable Cedric Froelich from the South African Parliament, and from Mr. Andres Aviva Ackelberg, who is a legislative expert from Mexico. We are all under instructions to be extremely brief. We will then be launching the joint statements towards the end. It will be available through a QR code, and we will be circulating it online at around 10 o'clock, I think, today. So I'm now going to hand over to Bolek to introduce what framework climate laws are and why they matter.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and hello to everyone here and online as well. My name is Bolesław Matuszewski. I'm also called Bolek. That's the short version of my name. And I work at ClientEarth. I work on framework climate laws along with my colleagues. Framework climate laws, for those who may be confused about why we call them framework climate laws, are those that really have a few functions connected also to NDCs and to the implementation of NDCs. So the main function is to make sure that targets at national and subnational level are enshrined into law so as to make them legally binding. That is the main function of a framework climate law. But why is it a framework law? Well, it's because it either reforms or creates a new governance structure in order to make sure that those targets can be implemented properly in a particular jurisdiction. And usually it's a national jurisdiction, but it doesn't have to be limited to a national jurisdiction, particularly in those countries that are federal entities. Also, when we look at what is very important here at this COP, climate finance, framework climate laws serve the function of ensuring that long-term and medium-term planning is done in a thought-out way, that it is done in a timely manner, that businesses know what to prepare for, what the regulatory framework will be in the long-term, medium-term, and of course in the short term. During this COP, or at least I personally heard, but I'm sure you've heard also, very many comments that is the crucial element now missing as far as the climate finance aspect is concerned. That businesses simply will not invest as much as they could invest, and countries will not contribute as much money as they could contribute to the issues of climate protection without a very clear national target, long-term, short-term, medium-term national target, and a very clear framework for climate governance. And the fourth element that framework climate laws serve to enshrine is the enforcement of the national targets and all of the national plans and subnational plans that are adopted within the framework. We know that NDCs should be enforceable on an international level. Right? Countries should make sure that other countries fulfill their NDCs and the promise that they've made on an international level. But I think from the perspective of effective implementation, actually the enforcement at a domestic level is just as important. And that domestic enforcement, if I can put it that way, that aspect of the implementation, that has been lacking in many, many jurisdictions. And a framework climate law properly constructed serves to fulfill that function as well. So from ClientEarth's perspective, there really are no downsides in adopting a framework climate law. Everyone wins by introducing this into their national legislation. From a government perspective, framework climate laws serve to streamline government functions, serve to identify and define very clearly what the particular government agencies are supposed to do in their national framework as regards climate protection. From a business perspective, you get the stability that is necessary for increased investment to be able to function in the business environment in the jurisdiction. From a civil society perspective, climate framework climate laws allow civil society to participate fully in the process of setting the climate policy agenda in the nation on a subnational level also. So it increases the buy-in of society, but it also ensures that civil society, where it sees a deficiency in the implementation of an NDC or other climate policy, can react in a timely manner and can persuade governments and businesses to correct any problems that are identified. And the identification of those problems also is usually accompanied by the opinion of an independent climate council that is established by such a framework climate law. And that is also a very important component of a properly constructed framework climate law. So in other words, we have all of these strands of climate policy, climate law that are supposed to come together to function in a beautiful system, but many times what we see is that these strands are sort of tied up in a knot of legislation. And framework climate laws allow for that knot to be untied and for particularly parliamentarians to engage in the process of making sure that those strands, if I can put it this way, construct a beautiful fabric of climate change policy that is effective in the short, medium, and long term. So that is why ClientEarth and WWF and global legislators feel that the next generation of framework climate laws will serve a very, very important function and should be adopted by as many jurisdictions as possible. We've seen this in jurisdictions so far, for example, the UK, New Zealand, South Africa. We know there's a gentleman here that will present on that. And we feel that this approach should be adopted in other jurisdictions broadly around the world. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Bolek. That was very clear and succinct. And I'm delighted now that we are joined by Mr. Manuel Pulgar Vidal. Manuel, please, we have a seat ready and waiting for you right here. And Manuel is no stranger to those of us who've been involved in COP processes because Manuel was our host in 2014 at the Lima COP. And Manuel, you're now with WWF. And of course, we have this partnership with you because of WWF's leadership on the agenda of what makes a robust NDC. So if you could please introduce what makes a robust NDC and why the three of us working together on this.
Sure, thank you. First, my deep apologies for being late. It has been a mistake in my calendar. Somebody put it at 10 a.m. because I am very punctual. And I ran from the other side to here. So sorry for that. It's Murphy's Law sometimes, the most important law ever. So, let me make a couple of comments. So here we are discussing NDCs and how can we make NDCs more instrumental for domestic policies to change fiscal, economic, energy policies, and to make it instrumental for our domestic development, that is on one side, and the role of law. No? So how much law can contribute to do those kind of things. Let me start by saying, probably in a very sad way, that we know that for the next cycle of the NDC, probably we will be exactly the same. So we won't put the world on track to the 1.5. That is the current expectation. That means that something is happening with the system. We have to make some adjustment to the system to encourage more parties and government to improve their NDC, no, and to put it well on track to our climate objective. So that is a reality. Some days ago, I used an analogy because of the iPhone 15 with iPhone 14. So probably we will have an iPhone 15 in the next cycle of the NDC. That means it is exactly the same, the iPhone 14. You remember those memes about the iPhone when it was updated. And that is sad, no? That is something that we have to work on. But the point it is, okay, that is about NDC, that it is about on what should we do in the global arena to make more enforceable the concept of net zero that can push government to really not only enhance NDCs, but also track progress on their target and fulfill and achieve their objective. That is in the global arena. And I am pretty sure that if we keep this open conversation, we will make that able probably by Brazil. That is my expectation, to have Brazil addressing that problem. But now let me move into the domestic legal side. So what is that role that the law can play? And I have many, many comments because I am an environmental lawyer. I've been working in environmental law since 1986 when, with a group of friends from the Faculty of Law, we created a Peruvian Society for Environmental Law. So that has been my career historically. Also, I went to Rio 92, so I have followed the full process. And then I joined the politics as minister in between 2011 and 2016 and as president of the COP20. So let me say a couple of things. If we think on what is that seat that made more possible to have environmental law evolving in most of the countries of the world, it was the Rio Declaration. Fantastic instrument. And look, a non-binding instrument, because the Rio Declaration, it was just that, a declaration, but with enough strong principles that made possible to legislators to recognize we can bring this principle of CBDR, we can bring sustainable development into our constitution. We can bring the precautionary principle. We can bring the preventive principle, or prevention, sorry, principle among some others. And if we go back, we will see how instrumental the Rio Declaration was. So I am always thinking, can we recreate that? And you know that when the French, some years ago, were pushing the idea of a global pact for the environment, I told them, what we should do it is to create new principles because the reality has already evolved. So we can develop principles, for example, to promote renewable energies, or a principle that can reflect well just transition. So a set of 5 or 6 new principles that can, again, recreate the idea on how to move the legislation to adopt it and to give a new impulse to the environmental law for that. So that is my first point. How can we recreate that? Because this process here is not helping legislators to understand what to do. But I have a second comment. It is what is happening with climate laws by now. Our framework laws are not defining concrete measures to be implemented, and that is part of the problem. So, yeah, sounds beautiful to say climate change is a priority in my country and we will adopt a mainstream climate in our blah, blah, blah. Beautiful, it is fantastic for many people. But what we do need to have, it is concrete measures for example, carbon pricing, or to regulate well the carbon markets, or to define well a transition to the renewable energies, and all the other elements that are mostly in our NDC, because I will move into that part of the NDC. So what I do want to say, it is we do need to be more concrete in proposing elements for our new law, climate laws, to really lever new actions in the domestic level. But let me move into a third topic, and this is not my phrase. No, I won't attribute the phrase for some others. Yesterday in an event, somebody said, look, nobody is voting because of climate. So you won't be president of your country because you approve an NDC. No, because nobody's care. Even more, nobody knows what does it means, an NDC. And that is the reality of the world. But you know, we have a good example of effectiveness with law, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. It's amazing. So the most important climate law in the US ever, in my point of view, it has been titled Inflation Reduction Act. And why? Because it is true, it is facing the inflation problem. But second, because people don't care about these NDCs, long-term strategy, and CQGs. People, it is worried because of the pocket, the health, the security, and those kind of things. So the point is how able we can be to make the law something that can respond to people's expectations. Because if not, we will never develop good laws that can really animate the process and that can create a good dynamic. That moves me, and tell me if I am taking too much time.
We do need to bring it to a close.
Yeah. Because I'm late and I'm taking too much time. It's like too much abuse.
Go ahead. Yeah.
But let me say a couple of things to finish. that also the law has to connect with the economy. And I have two things to say in relation to that. So we used to have this process as a very political one, no? When we were moving towards Paris, and even in Paris, the process, it was mostly a political process. But now in the implementation time, because now we have this kind of dynamic, the civil society dynamic, we have the business sector, we have the subnational government, this is becoming a more economic discussion, no? So the point is how much we are connecting the law with the dynamic of the economy. Because the economy is sending signals to the decision makers, to legislators, but also the regulation has to send a signal back to the economy. And that is something so important. Yesterday, and I suggest you to read it, a very important report, it has been released. Net zero policy matters. So what it is defining, it is how much the regulation must play a role to achieve net zero. I think this is like an essential book for legislators because it will send you a very good indicator or guidance on what it should be the role when it is about NDC. Let me finish by saying, I think that is, okay, and for sure what we do need to have, it is some mechanism to make the law enforceable, no? That is key, or to track progress, and to look, for example, how much we are evolving in fulfilling of our objective. Because, last phrase, it is, we developed this system in a voluntary basis. We know that. Now it is evolving into more mandatory, because the role of regulation, and that is the role of GLOB and legislator. If not, we will have courts defining the next. And it has started. It has started. Courts are defining a new role. Courts are now saying to some countries, your NDC, it is not enough ambitious. Or you company, oil company, no, you have to do something to decarbonize your process. Or no. So it is so interesting. Voluntary basis, mandatory, or imposed by the court. What do we want? That is something that always I am asking to the business sector. Do you want to be imposed by a court, or do you prefer to really evolve because of the law? So thank you very much, and again, my apologies for being late.
Thank you so much, Manuel. I'm going to pick up on further develop some of the ideas that both you and Bolek have mentioned. So, of course, you're both lawyers, environmental lawyers, and GLOBE represents the lawmakers. So just as a quick recap, why we are particularly interested and why this relationship is so timely is because GLOBE has been working to bring legislators from around the world, national parliaments principally, but increasingly also from subnational assemblies and parliaments. And we started this exercise before the Rio Earth Summit, and you're absolutely right. The Rio Earth Summit in 1992, unsaid as we called it, first time that the environment and development agendas were connected at an intergovernmental conference. At that time, parliamentarians did not have a platform to enter into these discussions. A GLOBE was created. And the Rio conventions, all three of them, have been extremely important as a basis for informing the actions of lawmakers, such that in 1997, when we had Kyoto, which was COP3, GLOBE's research showed that around the world at that time, there were around 54 pieces of climate change legislation, climate change laws and policies. You fast forward to 2015, and now, 2015, more than 2,000, now more than 3,000. So, as we know, more than 90% of the global economy is now covered by net zero commitments. And in virtually every country, there is some combination of climate change, stroke environment, stroke sustainability legislation. That's not enough. Now, you made the point about litigation. What happens when people take to the courts because they do not see that the solutions are coming from the governments themselves? We've seen a massive spike in litigation since 2015. At the Paris Climate Conference, GLOBE brought together legislators and judges for the first time to see what they could learn from each other, because we had already had Paris marked the first generation of climate change laws. And so we invited judges from around the world to provide us with a review of how was the legislation that had already been put in place in between 1997 and 2015 working. And they said, well, there are lots of gaps here. Because if there weren't gaps, if there was not an adequate redress through existing legislation, people wouldn't be coming to the courts to seek that redress. So fast forward now to 2014. We are on the eve of 2025, 2024 now, and getting lost in the midst of time. And we are now at a very different juncture because Paris gave us the NDCs. And Paris also gave us the ratchet mechanism. So Globe did a piece of work last year to look at the first global stocktake and to address how were parliaments involved in that process. And there were extremely few parliamentarians, who even knew that there was a global stocktake taking place. And our research showed that there was just a small sprinkling of perhaps 1 or 2 members of parliament and a few committees who were even observing what was going on through their executive branch. And that is simply not good enough. And it's one of the reasons why we have such weak NDCs, because they have not been subject to the deliberative process which parliaments imply and the scrutiny, the oversights that parliamentarians are constitutionally tasked with undertaking. And so we have decided that we cannot allow this same passivity to afflict the NDC 3.0 process, because the NDCs 3.0 mark a leapfrog. They have to mark a leapfrog in ambition. And they mark the next generation of NDCs because they are across the real economy. And that is what connects this NDC with the interest, not just of the business community, the investors community. So the NDCs have to be an investors' charter for countries. We've had lots of discussions here about the importance of net zero policies guiding national industrial policy. But if that is not anchored in domestic legislation, investors will lack the certainty, the predictability, the confidence to want to invest in a country. So these are all some of the reasons why we thought that this partnership is extremely timely and valuable, because we want there to be a difference in the next few months. We want parliamentarians to take an active interest in this and to help define what a fit-for-purpose national development, nationally determined contributions, terrible, terrible acronym. More, as you said, with the success of the IRA, it has to be a much more catchy title, preferably which doesn't have climate in it. So we hope that we can make a difference in this, which is why we have teamed up together. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have provided you with a rationale for why ClientEarth, WWF, and Globe are working together on this agenda. And we would now like to open it, so we will step back, and we would now like to bring in those in government and those who are specialists within the intergovernmental bodies on NDCs to please provide their insights, their comments on what they've heard, and to help us in this process. So thank you very much, Bolek and Manuel. And I would now like to call, please, to our stage, our very small and intimate stage, Mr. Jan Dusic, the Deputy Director General for Climate Action at the European Commission, Mr. Matt Toombs, please, Director of International Climate Change. If you can find your picture and just sit in front of it, that would be ideal. I think, Jan, you're in the middle. Yes, Matt, as close as possible. Fantastic. And, of course, we have Sanji Lee, UNDP's Global Technical Specialist on the NDCs. So why don't we start with you, Jan, please.
Well, thank you very much, and a great pleasure to be here. I also happen to be a lawyer, an environmental lawyer, so but I will speak. I could speak to many things. What was said in the beginning, but let me focus on the experience from the European Union, which I'm representing here as the Commission, because I think that gives a good illustration of all the topics that are related. We will have about 12 to 15 members of European Parliament coming to the COP. They are coming every year, and I think it's a healthy practice to bring the parliamentarians into the negotiations. We are dealing with an issue which extends the lifespan of the election periods, and it's part of the problem. It has been part of the problem, how to ensure the long-term vision and at the same time get re-elected in the next elections. So I think that what we need to succeed is to to have the commitment across the political landscape to have some kind of consensus around what needs to happen, and then that translates to the role of the parliaments and the laws, the framework laws that can be adopted. It cannot be that it shouldn't be, but it happens that there is one government that goes in one direction, and then there is an election, and then the next government goes in the opposite direction. And I think we have beautiful examples these days of this happening. And it shouldn't be the case, because then it disrupts the long-term objective, and it basically makes it impossible to live up to the Paris Agreement. European Union perspective. So we have a European climate law, which was based on agreement of the 27 heads of states heads of states and governments of the EU, the European Union Council, and on that basis, which said that there will be a target of climate neutrality by 2050. This has been enshrined in the framework European climate law. From that target, we have derived the target for 2030, which is 55% emission reduction. And from that target in the European climate law, then we have the set of legislation. We like to legislate in the EU. We have a lot of regulation. It's a very complicated process, but in the end of the day, this translates to a set of legislation, which we now refer to Fit for 55. And that's basically implementing it. The ETS is at the core of it. And there's many pieces that go into all the areas that matter in the climate change action. So this is what we have at the moment. We are in the stage of delivery of this Fit for 55 package, and we are up to speed. We are confident that we will be able to fulfill our 55% promise. So now, of course, we have to look at the new NDC, which will be targeting 2035. We have our cycle in the European climate law of decades, so we need to look for a 2030 target. We have asked the scientists for advice, and the scientists told us that the new target should be in the range of 85 to 95% reduction. There's several scenarios, and the European Commission has proposed, and here will come the role of the Parliament very soon, that we should have a 90% target by 2040. When the new target for 2040 is agreed, we will then derive the 2035 target, and that will be the NDC that the EU, with its member states, will be submitting towards COP30. Now, the role of the Parliament, this is, as I said, a proposal of the Commission, which is the executive body of the EU. This is a political priority of the new Commission that will start its function on the 1st of December. And very soon, the Commission will present this draft proposal of the amendment of the European climate law, which basically can say, we add a line saying by 2040, 90%. And then again, once there is an agreement with the co-legislators, we will translate this into a new set of legislation that would relate to the 2040 pathway. Now, this agreement requires agreement with the member states, and that's the Council in the EU, and the Parliament. One other way of understanding the dynamics, not just the formal role in the adoption of the legislation, is that each of the members of the new Commission are vetted by the European Parliament, starting with the Commission President and then all the members. We are now in the final stage of this vetting. This is also why the Commission President couldn't come here, because the final hearings of the Commissioners and the Vice Presidents were taking place this week in Brussels. But there is a lot of discussion with a number of the Commissioners around the climate targets, and basically, once they are cleared, this is also the vetting of the new Commission political agenda and the mission letters that each of the commissioners have from the Commission President. So we will have the buy-in from the European Parliament for the new Commission and its political program, and that gives us confidence that the Parliament will be ready to view this new amendment of the European climate law. Last thing to say on this, we are also we want this to be a cosmetic but hugely important amendment of the climate law, but at the same time we want to add one leg to it, which is adaptation. And adaptation in Europe is something which many people do, but it requires more coherence, and we think that we would want to have some competency in adaptation and building resilience enshrined in the next European climate law.
So thank you very much for that. Jan, if I may just, sorry, we're running short of microphones here. Yeah, it's also worth pointing out that the European Commission has maintained level of ambition. Of course, there is, one can argue whether it's sufficient, but as you've noted, the trajectory continues to be forward and upwards, despite the results of the European election. This, of course, has been the super election year this year. I'm now going to turn to Matt Toombs to provide the national government perspective. A new government in office, a recent announcement. Matt, your thoughts?
Brilliant, thank you, Malini, and it's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. I think this is such an important issue in terms of tackling the climate crisis, but also in terms of now and the challenge that we're facing now, because the next round of NDCs is the fundamental challenge that we're facing over the next 6 to 12 months. I'm actually not a lawyer, so I'm the first non-lawyer to be speaking here. I'm a policymaker. But I spent a lot of my career at the start actually working in the Treasury in the UK, so I really understand the importance of this being embedded in an understanding of the economy and the sort of fiscal arrangement of each country. We've been delighted in the UK to be able to start this COP bringing our new NDC. So you've hopefully heard that we've announced our at least 81% NDC based on 1990 baseline for 2035. That was in response to our Climate Change Commission, who provide independent advice on it. Their advice was that that was the highest possible ambition in the UK, and that it was a ratchet on previous levels, and was crucially was deliverable. So it combined that fullest stretch possible while still being achievable and deliverable. It meets all of the elements of the global stocktake, which we also saw as a really important element of the agreement last year in the COP, that the next round of NDCs, that they would be economy-wide, that they cover all greenhouse gases, that they'd be aligned by 1.5 degrees, and really important that we all work with countries across the world to make sure that the next round do reflect those commitments that we collectively made through in the global stocktake last year. Just a few kind of thoughts about the UK framework and the way that operates. We've had a framework climate law in place since 2008 with the Climate Change Act, and that has played a crucial role really in the providing the conditions for us to be able to set and govern the way that we tackle climate change and that we decarbonise within the UK. It's got a number of features that is worth sort of highlighting. One of which is the requirement. So it creates a domestic legislative requirement on the government to set climate targets far out in advance. One of the elements that really works through this process is that we have to set a target 12 years ahead. And Jan, you were talking about the 2040 decadal approach in the Commission. This has been very much a kind of decadal approach in the UK that we've had since 2008. And it means that we're planning sufficiently far in advance to mean that we can bring in the independent experts, the scientists to provide advice. We can then provide long-term certainty to businesses, to investors, to others, to be able to have confidence in the direction that the country is taking. You give time to be able to develop the right policy frameworks, to be able to kind of work through and implement and deliver on that. And it's meant that the 2035 target that we've announced, although it's a commitment of the new government, it is also completely aligned with the carbon budget that we've already legislated for in the UK. And so there's actually not been an addition of effort from the 81% than the plans we already had and that we were already held to account by within our legislature. So it really helps when you're then needing to come forward with the level of ambition that's needed, that we've done it sufficiently far in advance to to mean that it can be fully grounded in the kind of science and the evidence. I completely agree that the enforcement then is absolutely crucial. And the other sort of key element of the UK setup is the creation of the Climate Change Commission, which has the function of being independent of government, bringing together expert scientific and policy advice to recommend both the levels of targets, but also provide progress reports on government action and the level of progress being made against those legislative targets. So there's a report every year given to Parliament. It gives Parliament then some real substance to debate and a very clear, unvarnished view of how far progress is making. These make for pretty uncomfortable reading at times for people like me in government, and certainly for the ministers who are facing challenge. Certainly over the last few years, there have been some, very clear, frank reports talking about, where progress is being made, but also the clear gaps and where further progress needs to be made to meet targets. So I think that clear, frank, open, scientific-based reporting on an annual basis is incredibly important. It does hold us to account, and I agree. It then it means that while there is legal challenge, and we will see direct legal challenge on individual firms and different activities, it focuses a lot of the legal attention actually on the policy framework itself, and ensuring that the policy framework is sufficient, and then ensuring that the government has a sufficient set of plans in place to mean that it can meet its targets. And if that's sufficient, then it gives companies the confidence that they're unlikely to be exposed to legal criticism if they're operating with a framework that meets the legislated national target. So I agree that it's actually helpful, I think, for business to know that they will be relatively protected from individual legal action as long as they're operating within a framework that has been tested legally to be sufficient against the legislative framework. So yeah, the final thing I'll just bring out is the need for then the action to be very much whole of government, and the approach the UK is bringing now is under this new government is something called mission-led government, and the idea is to have a laser-like focus on a set of goals, and clean energy by 2030 is one of those goals which underpins our NDC. And the idea is to then bring together all the parts of government behind one single mission, reporting directly to the Prime Minister, so that you can get that absolute focus on what kind of each part of the system needs to do to deliver it. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. And as you say, the Climate Change Act of 2008 has really been the gold standard for climate change legislation over this time. It's provided a very clear framework for action, predictability for investors, and most importantly, an independent committee which provides annually evidence-based information and reports to Parliament. It's also been subject to review itself, and what's interesting is that you mentioned the importance of adaptation. Of course, the global goal on adaptation is something that has increasingly gained in prominence, as it should. The Climate Change Act was relatively silent about adaptation, so that is an area where post-legislative parliamentary scrutiny, that phrase, comes into play. The need for independent experts and advice, of course, I'm going to turn to you, Sanjili, is absolutely essential in all this. So your views, please, on the NDCs and what would make more robust NDCs.
Thank you. Sorry, thank you. I know we got about 3 minutes, so I'm going to be very short in my intervention. And I'm the second person who doesn't have the legal background, so I'm going to talk focused on the NDCs. So as we all know, the temperature records are broken every day. The climate impacts are widespread and devastating. And we know these impacts are now intertwined with the biodiversity loss, the fiscal crisis, and also interlinked with the global conflicts. So that's why the coming years during which the countries are expected to revise their NDC really stands as the humanity's best opportunity to really stay within this 1.5 temperature goal, the targets we have. Unfortunately, we know that the latest the emission gap report from the UNEP says we're pretty off the track. Even though we are fully implementing all the measures in the NDC, that will only get us to 2.6 scenario. So that means we all need to step up. And of course, the G20 countries really need to take the leadership. So very happy to hear the EU and the UK really taking the leadership on this. I wanted to also talk a little bit on a positive note. We talked about the NDC ratchet mechanism. And I can share from our experience from the Climate Promise team of the UNDP, where we've supported more than 140 countries on NDCs for their second round of NDCs. And we see that this ratchet mechanism is working. So if you compare with the first generation of the NDCs, the second generation of the NDCs are more robust. They're backed by the data. And also, if you look at the NDC synthesis report that was just released by the UNFCCC, more than 95% of the NDCs now, they have a quantified mitigation targets. More than 85 of those NDCs are now economy-wide, which is very important to get us aligned with the 1.5 degree. So also from our experiences supporting the NDCs, we know the countries are taking more and more of the whole of society approaches, meaning that they're taking the right consultations involving different stakeholders. It remains to be seen how much have they actually consulted with the parliamentarians, which is a very important point, but they're consulting with different stakeholders to really have the ownership of the NDCs and make sure they really talk about things that matters to people. In terms of the climate change legislations, the synthesis report also points out that 48% of the NDCs have integrated their NDC targets in some sort of climate change laws and regulatory frameworks. It's a positive sign, but that means much more can be done. So I think this is a really great opportunity as countries are revising their NDCs that we really integrate these dimensions and have enhanced ambitions so we can get to the 1.5. This year, we talked about finance a lot. This COP is all about finance, NCQG, but also this COP is about transparency. And I see this is where we should pay a little more attention to the climate change legislations and regulatory frameworks, because even though you have money, in order to implement those NDC targets, you need some sort of legally binding commitments. And we talk about money a lot, but then it has to be also used in a very right way, right? In Ecuador, they have the presidential decree to mandate all ministries to integrate the carbon tagging in all their budgeting decisions. And this shows that it's not just the money. You need to have all these bolts and nuts in place to use the money in a right way, so that will get us closer to the 1.5 targets. The second biggest focus of this COP is the transparency. Countries are expected to submit their BTR this year. And I think this is where I also see an opportunity of the climate change legislations, where the parliamentarians are brought in, and then they have this sort of accountability mechanisms to make sure that targets are being monitored and then going through that scrutiny processes, so it can help and complement the BTR processes. So I think, yeah, I very much welcome these discussions and really look forward to see countries raising their ambitions in the next round. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sanjin. We hope to work closely with UNDP, Promise, and all the other initiatives on this, because, of course, the focus of Globe in the Pavilion this week really has been on raising awareness about NDC 3.0, working with NDC Partnership. There are a lot of resources out there, but also on the BTR, which stands for the Biannual Transparency Review, which most parliaments have never heard of, most people have never heard of. So there's a real job here in terms of education and communication. We look forward to working more with you on that. On this note, we did start late, so I do want to thank everybody. All the speakers have been extremely pithy and succinct so far, but I would like to thank all three of those on the stage now and invite our next two speakers. Thank you very much. I'd like to invite Honourable Cedric Froelich, lawmaker from South Africa, and a leader in the Globe community for many, many years. And Andres Avila Ackerberg also, please. A legislative specialist from Mexico. Cedric, extremely important to have you here because, of course, we're not the practitioners. Yeah, we're the commentators, but you are in the hot seat as a lawmaker. And South Africa has recently enacted its first framework climate change law. So from where you're sitting, how do these issues come together?
No, good morning to everyone, and thank you for the opportunity. I think it's important to note, before the Climate Change Act was promulgated by the President, there were a number of pieces of other legislation. The energy law. You had the law dealing with carbon tax, But all of it was very sector specific, dealing with specific areas in government. And what the climate change law basically does is to bring together everything. And it also asks for alignment from the different government departments. So it is designed, firstly, to define, to manage, monitor, and implement South Africa's transition to a low-carbon and climate-resilient economy. What is important to notice, though, was that the lawmaking process was a bottom-up approach, where all sectors in society played a role, and it was effected by having public hearings, listening to what the public have to say, listening to what industry have to say. And importantly, South Africa decided, because we forget about something called COVID-19 very often, is that our recovery out of the recession would be a green recovery. The president in 2020 then established the Presidential Climate Commission. The Climate Commission, their task is, and they are multi-sectoral, they are independent, it is to guide government in terms of reaching our ambition and to move to a response, a clear response to climate change. Very importantly, they report also annually. Similarly, like in the UK, they report through the presidency, but they report directly to Parliament as well, where they can be called and they can be held accountable. They are a juristic entity, so they are managed under the Public Finance Management Act as well. And they play a critical role, because since its establishment, it has now been incorporated into the Climate Change Act. They are part of it, so it's not a separate entity any longer, and that gives legal enforcement to the work that they are doing. And yes, they do come up with very uncomfortable information and facts that politicians cannot easily ignore. So in a nutshell, the Climate Change Act that was signed into law by the President in July this year, just after the election, is now being operationalized, where we have, for instance, as part of it, in the law, in the Act, there's mitigation targets, right? There's carbon budgets that are being introduced. There's sectoral emission targets that are being introduced. So we look forward, not only learning from other countries who have similar laws, but also to ramp up the ambition that government needs in terms of its new NDCs that needs to be put in place. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cedric. That is such a positive and encouraging story. I'd now like to turn to Andres Avila Ackerberg, who is also a member of the Globe family over many years, but really a specialist on the drafting of environmental and also climate legislation in Mexico. And so where we have in South Africa the most recent example of a framework climate change law, in Mexico we have one of the oldest, 2010, and it's now undergoing a review. So you've been very much on the inside track on this, Andres. It would be really helpful for us to have an understanding of what's happening in Mexico and how the NDC 3.0 process is aligning with that review.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you, Malini. Nice to be here with you and Mr. Cedric. Nice to see you again. Yeah, I've been around this lawmaking for maybe 15 years, and not from the Congress, not from government, but from civil society mainly, and trying to push climate legislation forward. We were involved in the original Mexican law, which was passed 2012, the first developing country law, the second after UK. And since then, we have been doing climate legislation at the subnational level. You know, Mexico, like many countries here, big countries. So if you have a national law, it's not enough. You need the different actors to also have their legislation. And it's been a very interesting process because we don't just work with legislators, we work with the governments and with stakeholders. So we do a participatory process. We try to gather the more information because, you know, you can have a lot of technicalities, but they don't necessarily reflect reality. I don't know what, I mean, if you get what I mean. For us, is the more you socialize a process, the better gets implemented, because the one you consult, the one who wants the law to be implemented. So the most people you can reach, the best. And when we finally have a proposal, And we have done this with 17 states out of 32. 9 laws have been approved already. It is legitimized, right? Is like the decision maker that gets the proposal. It is like a low-hanging fruit. No, it's like they cannot say no to that piece of legislation because it has been the result of a very important process. So, and eventually, is also we try to find champions from Congress, local Congresses. It's not an easy topic, you know. Maybe people that are here, they know about climate change, but our regular Congress people, they are not experts, no? And we have to understand that, and they have so many things to think about, so many different topics every day, so why should they care about climate change, no? So that's what we do also. We try to convince them that this is something to be. Of course, in some parts of Mexico, there is a lot of consciousness about the damages. So then they know about climate change, no? In the coasts, in the Pacific, in the Atlantic. So I think this has been a very interesting exercise because from that empirical exercise, we have gathered information that we now can put in this new generation of laws, no? Of course, there is the institutionality, the cross-cutting, the goals. Interestingly, the laws that we have worked at the state level, they have a net zero target. But the country doesn't have yet a net zero target. So the states have taken the leadership. And I think from that experience, we have been working for a year now on a new climate law in Mexico, the national. Because as I was saying, no, the first one was a big achievement, but we didn't like it because it wasn't too ambitious. No? And now in the process of this NDC 3.0 next year, you know, our country has just changed administration. We have a new government, and the new government, we are very happy because they have said already that the NDC will go from 35 to 45%, which is already an accomplishment. Of course, it needs to be implemented. But the thing is that this exercise that we have gathered around the last year, interviewing all states, many stakeholders, a lot of surveys, a lot of information, to adapt it to this current administration. So on Wednesday, by the way, we have an event here with government officers from Mexico that I will hope they will take this initiative forward. But my point is that this new round of laws is different because there is some concept that didn't exist back in they did exist, but back in 2012 when we passed our first law, we didn't talk that much about climate justice, for example. And that's something we have seen from the people. They want to see climate justice in a piece of legislation. They want to see adaptation, no? That's what you can feel, but it's very, they want to see goals. They want to see financial instruments because it's always a problem. People that are not in the climate sector, they say like there is no money, no? There will never be money. So climate laws have to go into financial instruments to trigger, for example, criteria for public budget to set how to get money out of the public budget into climate, how to get carbon markets, how to get fiscal instruments. So there is so much information, but I think it's a very good timing, and I really appreciate this work Globe is doing to gather here in terms of discussing, because it's always so interesting to share with other countries what they are doing and what we have been doing for the last 7 years. So thank you for the invitation.
Thanks very much, Andres. It shows that there are very different processes here at work. So both South Africa and Mexico have engaged in wide-ranging consultations and have a bottom-up process. Mexico is one of the countries, I think Kenya is the other one, in which you have exceptionally strong climate change legislation at the subnational level. And if we had Kenyan members of parliament who were here, they would also inform us that in Kenya, they are also able to raise their own finance for these subnational legislative commitments that they make on climate change. So I think that we have, unfortunately, we've gone well over time, but this really is an appetizer because there are so many connection points with themes which are running again and again. You ended on the role of finance. There's no point having any plan unless you have a finance plan which is backing it. So we have a number of conversations which are taking place with those from the investment and finance community. Yesterday there was a very important whole day session on the role of business, investment and philanthropy, creating a new climate platform, because there is so much which is happening out there in the world of private and blended finance. New financial instruments, extremely interesting ones from Southeast Asia, but Cedric, also incredibly important ones from the African continent. I heard yesterday of not just the concept of foreign direct investment, but Africa direct investment, which is now being catalyzed because there is an African continental free trade agreement. So all these are issues and areas where we need to make sure that we get members of parliament who see themselves as environmental champions first and foremost, need to educate themselves about what's happening within the financial world. Everybody is transitioning. We all need to work together on this. But just coming back to the theme of the day, which is really this joint statement, this new partnership between ClientEarth, WWF, and Globe, where we bring our constituencies together to promote conservation, to promote conversation, and to promote action on this collectively. So thank you very much for your participation here in person and all those who are joining us on the live stream, and we will make this recording available also very soon. Thank you so much once again.